park ranger was simply doing a routine patrol in a popular park when he noticed something strange in the swamp. Rusted school lockers, bound together with chains, had been lying there for decades. But when one of them was finally opened, what was inside shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The park existed in the public imagination as a promise. It was the kind of place printed on brochures and billboards, a carefully maintained vision of untouched nature offered to families, hikers, and school groups as proof that something pure still remained. Wooden boardwalks stretched over shallow water, their planks replaced regularly, their railings sanded smooth by decades of careful maintenance. Informational signs stood at polite intervals, explaining migratory birds, wetland plants, and the delicate balance between water and soil. Visitors took photographs beneath cypress trees draped in moss, convinced they were witnessing something ancient and serene, something that had always been this way. What most of them never understood was how much of the park had been shaped, corrected, and concealed. Beneath the curated paths and scenic overlooks lay a far larger territory that did not appear on maps handed out at the entrance gates. Beyond the last public trail marker, the land changed character. The soil grew softer, the air heavier. The carefully managed sounds of nature gave way to something more chaotic and unresolved. In those places, the park no longer performed for an audience. It simply existed. The ranger knew this better than most. He had walked these boundaries for years, memorizing the subtle shifts in terrain that marked where responsibility outweighed spectacle. His name appeared on internal schedules and equipment logs, but among his colleagues he was known less for conversation than for consistency. He arrived early, left late, and treated each patrol as if it mattered in ways that could not be recorded in reports. For him, the park was not a symbol or an attraction. It was a living system layered with time, shaped as much by human decisions as by water and weather. He had chosen this profession deliberately. Long before he wore the uniform, he had understood that land carried memory. He had grown up hearing stories of places erased, neighborhoods cut apart by highways, communities displaced and then forgotten because the earth itself offered no testimony. Working as a ranger gave him a sense of guardianship that went beyond enforcing rules or guiding visitors. It allowed him to stand watch over ground that could not speak for itself. The popular sections of the park were predictable. Tour buses arrived on schedule. Families followed loops designed to bring them back safely to parking lots. Volunteers restocked pamphlet racks and swept debris from observation decks. Everything about that side of the park suggested order and reassurance. But the ranger's assignments often took him elsewhere, into areas marked on internal charts with neutral designations that disguised their complexity. Some were labeled as flood control zones, others as restoration areas, still others simply as restricted wetlands. These zones had histories no one bothered to recount anymore. They had been drained, reflooded, rerouted, and abandoned over decades of policy changes and funding shifts. Old service roads vanished into vegetation. Wooden platforms collapsed and were left where they fell. In certain places, rusted markers protruded from the mud, their original purpose lost to time. The ranger made note of all of it, not because he expected to need the information, but because neglect often began with forgetting. That morning, the park was quieter than usual. A recent storm had passed through the region, dumping heavy rain upstream and swelling the waterways that fed into the wetlands. While the public areas remained open, Internal advisories had been issued for staff to inspect vulnerable sections of the park. Flooding changed landscapes quickly, uncovering things that had been hidden for years or burying features that once stood in plain sight. The ranger reviewed the advisory notices and compared them with his own knowledge of the terrain. One section caught his attention immediately. It was an area he had walked dozens of times, a stretch of swampland that bordered a decommissioned service canal. The official language described it as stable but sensitive, prone to erosion after prolonged rainfall. What the notice did not mention was how little documentation existed about what lay beneath its surface. He prepared his gear methodically, checking his boots, securing his radio, and reviewing old survey maps stored digitally on his device. The maps were incomplete, stitched together from different decades, each reflecting a different philosophy of land management. Some marked features that no longer existed. Others showed blank spaces where the ranger knew there was terrain that had simply never been fully cataloged. As he drove toward the restricted access point, the familiar divide between the park's public face and its concealed reality became evident. The road narrowed, the signage disappeared, and the manicured edges gave way to wild growth pressing close to the vehicle. When he parked and stepped out, the air felt heavier, saturated with moisture and the faint metallic scent that often followed flooding. The path into the wetlands was not a trail in the traditional sense. It was a route known only to staff, shaped by repeated passage rather than design. Fallen branches and exposed roots forced him to move carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. The ground yielded underfoot, water pooling around his boots before slowly receding. As he advanced deeper into the restricted zone, the storm's effects became more apparent. Water lines clung to tree trunks higher than usual, and debris hung suspended in branches where the current had carried it. In some places, the flood had scoured away layers of sediment, exposing darker soil beneath. The ranger paused frequently, scanning the surroundings, noting changes that might require further attention. It was during one of these pauses that he felt a subtle shift in awareness, a sense that something in the landscape did not align with its surroundings. At first, it was nothing more than an impression, a barely perceptible regularity where there should have been disorder. He adjusted his position, angling his view between the roots of several trees, and that was when he noticed it. Amid the tangled vegetation and uneven ground, there was a line that was too straight. Nature rarely produced right angles, and yet here was a faint but unmistakable edge, partially obscured by mud and plant matter. The ranger moved closer, lowering himself carefully to avoid disturbing the saturated soil. He brushed aside leaves and vines, revealing a surface that resisted his touch. Metal. The discovery did not immediately alarm him. The park contained remnants of past infrastructure scattered throughout its boundaries. Old pipes, discarded equipment, and forgotten machinery occasionally surfaced after storms. What unsettled him was the shape and orientation of this object. As he cleared more debris, the straight line extended, forming a corner, then another edge, suggesting a larger structure beneath the mud. He worked slowly, methodically, uncovering enough to understand that this was not a single object but part of something larger. The metal was corroded, its original color barely visible beneath layers of rust and residue. As more of it emerged, the ranger realized he was looking at the side of a locker, the kind once common in schools and institutional buildings. He continued clearing, his movements careful, his breathing steady. One locker became 2, then 3, all aligned in a row. They were pressed tightly together, their sides touching, as if assembled deliberately. His attention shifted to the seams between them where thick chains threaded through handles and vents, binding the units into a single mass. The locks were still in place. That detail changed everything. Discarded lockers would not have been chained shut. The effort required to secure them in this way suggested intent, not convenience. The ranger straightened slightly, surveying the area with renewed focus. The lockers extended beyond what he had uncovered, disappearing beneath roots and sediment, their length impossible to determine without excavation. He felt a growing unease, not born of fear, but of recognition. This was not an accident of dumping or erosion. Someone had brought these lockers here, chained them, and left them to sink into the swamp. The location was not random. It was remote, inaccessible, and subject to flooding that would quickly conceal anything placed within it. He stood in silence for a long moment, listening to the distant sounds of the wetlands. Birds moved through the canopy. Insects droned steadily. The park, in its indifference, offered no reaction to the discovery. For the ranger, however, the patrol had already changed in character. What began as a routine inspection had become something else entirely. He documented the find carefully, capturing images from multiple angles and recording coordinates. His report would need to be precise, unemotional, grounded in observable facts. Yet, even as he performed these tasks, his thoughts moved ahead, considering what might be hidden behind those locked metal doors and why no record of them existed. As he turned back toward the path, preparing to report the discovery, the ranger glanced once more at the lockers, half buried and silent. The park had kept it secret for decades, presenting visitors with tranquility while concealing something darker beneath the surface. The storm had disturbed that balance, exposing a fragment of the past that refused to remain hidden. He did not yet know what the lockers contained. He only knew that the land had revealed them deliberately, as if deciding that enough time had passed. And, as he made his way back through the wetlands, the ranger carried with him the certainty that the park everyone believed was safe had always been holding something it was never meant to keep. The ranger did not return to the wetlands alone. That decision, made quietly as he filed his initial report, marked the first shift in how the park itself began to respond to what had been uncovered. The discovery of the lockers was no longer an isolated observation recorded in a patrol log. It had become an irregularity that demanded verification, context, and caution. Yet, before any supervisors or specialists could be dispatched, protocol required a second inspection. The storm had altered the terrain, and it was possible, however unlikely, that the initial impression had been incomplete. Early the next morning, before visitors arrived and before the heat began to rise from the saturated ground, the ranger returned to the restricted zone. The park, at that hour, felt suspended between states, not yet awakened to its public role, still lingering in the private rhythms of the night. Mist hovered low over the water, clinging to reeds and cypress knees, softening the edges of everything it touched. The air carried the smell of decay and renewal, vegetation breaking down even as new growth pushed upward through the mud. The route felt different now. Where the previous day's patrol had been routine until its abrupt disruption, this walk carried an undercurrent of expectation. Every step seemed heavier, not because the ground was less stable, but because the ranger knew precisely where he was going and why. The land no longer presented itself as an environment to be monitored. It had become a site of inquiry. As he moved deeper into the swamp, he paid closer attention to the subtle details he might have otherwise overlooked. the way the water pooled unnaturally in certain depressions, the absence of smaller plant life near the area of discovery, the faint discoloration of the mud, darker and more viscous than elsewhere. These were not dramatic signs, but together they suggested prolonged disturbance, something introduced into the ecosystem that did not belong. When the lockers came into view again, partially obscured by vegetation and shadow, their presence felt more imposing than it had the day before. What had initially appeared as a curious anomaly now asserted itself as a deliberate intrusion. The straight lines and uniform shapes stood in stark contrast to the organic chaos of the swamp. They looked less like debris and more like a structure that had been buried intentionally. The ranger approached slowly, retracing his previous steps. He knelt near the exposed corner and resumed clearing away the remaining mud, expanding the visible area. The metal was colder than the surrounding soil, its surface pitted and flaking under his gloves. As more of the row emerged, the scale of the find became clearer. The lockers extended further than he had first realized, disappearing beneath the waterlogged earth in both directions. He followed the line with his eyes, counting at least a dozen units visible, possibly more still concealed. Each locker was identical in size and design, unmistakably institutional, the kind mass-produced for schools and government facilities in the mid-20th century. Their uniformity suggested they had all come from the same place, removed at the same time, transported and discarded as a single entity. The chains binding them were thick, industrial-grade, looped through handles and vents with a precision that ruled out improvisation. This was not the work of someone disposing of scrap metal casually. The locks, though corroded, remained intact, their mechanisms frozen by rust but unbroken. The ranger examined one closely, noting that it had been secured while the locker was still functional, before exposure to water and time rendered it inert. He straightened and scanned the surrounding area, looking for any trace of access routes that might explain how such a heavy structure had been brought into the swamp. There were no visible tracks, no remnants of roads or platforms, but decades of flooding and regrowth could easily erase such evidence. The absence of obvious paths did not mean they had never existed. As he moved around the perimeter of the discovery, another detail emerged. The lockers were not simply resting on the surface beneath the mud. They appeared to have sunk into a shallow trench, the ground around them subtly contoured as if it had been disturbed and then allowed to settle. This suggested that the placement had been intentional, planned with enough foresight to ensure the structure would remain submerged. The ranger felt a tightening in his chest, not from fear, but from the weight of implication. The park's restricted zones had always been places where the boundaries between natural preservation and human interference blurred. But this crossed a different line. This was not infrastructure left behind after a failed project. It was concealment. He documented everything meticulously, expanding his photographic record and updating his notes with new observations. Coordinates were confirmed, measurements estimated, conditions described in neutral language. Still, the facts themselves carried a gravity that could not be softened by professionalism. When he finally stepped back from the site, the ranger lingered, allowing himself a moment to consider the broader context. The park had been established long after these lockers were likely deposited, its boundaries drawn, its mission defined, without full knowledge of what lay beneath its wetlands. Generations of visitors had walked its trails, unaware that something sealed and silent rested just beyond their reach. As he prepared to leave the area again, the ranger noticed something else that unsettled him further. Near the base of one locker, partially obscured by mud, was a fragment of faded paint that suggested a number, perhaps an inventory marking. He could not make out the full designation, but its presence reinforced the impression that these lockers had once been part of a system, cataloged and accounted for, before being deliberately erased. The walk back felt longer. Each sound in the swamp seemed amplified, each movement scrutinized. The ranger was acutely aware now that the land was no longer neutral ground. It had become a witness, holding on to evidence long after those responsible believed it lost. By the time he reached his vehicle, the ranger had already decided that this discovery could not be handled quietly. Whatever lay inside those lockers had been sealed away with intention and effort. The storm had merely accelerated an exposure that was perhaps inevitable. Water receded, sediment shifted, and eventually, even the most carefully buried secrets found their way back to the surface. As he drove toward headquarters to escalate the report, the ranger understood that the park's identity was about to change. The anomaly in the swamp was no longer just an irregularity in the landscape. It was the first visible fracture in a carefully maintained illusion of safety and simplicity, a sign that beneath the park's tranquil exterior lay a history that had never truly been resolved. By the time the ranger reached headquarters, the park had already begun to wake. Maintenance vehicles rolled through service roads, radios crackled with routine updates, and the administrative building hummed with the familiar rhythm of daily operations. On the surface, nothing had changed. Yet the information he carried with him shifted the weight of every ordinary detail. The park still functioned, but it did so unknowingly, standing atop something that no longer fit within its official narrative. He filed his report formally, attaching photographs, coordinates, and a measured description of the discovery. He avoided speculation, focusing instead on observable facts: the number of lockers visible, their condition, the chains and locks, the apparent trench beneath them. The language was precise, deliberately restrained. Experience had taught him that credibility depended on clarity, especially when introducing something that would inevitably disrupt routine. The initial response from administration was cautious. Supervisors reviewed the material in silence, their expressions revealing little beyond professional concern. Old infrastructure remnants were not unheard of, and the park had encountered hazardous materials before. Still, the deliberate chaining and the scale of the structure prevented an easy dismissal. The decision was made to halt public access to the nearest adjacent area under the guise of flood-related safety concerns while a deeper review was conducted. The next step was archival verification. If the lockers had been placed there legally or as part of an old project, there would be some record of it. The ranger was asked to assist, not because he was an archivist, but because he understood the terrain and could help contextualize whatever documents were uncovered. The park's archives were housed in a climate-controlled room beneath the administrative wing, a quiet space filled with filing cabinets, shelves of binders, and digital terminals that accessed scanned records. The ranger had been there before, usually for minor reference checks. This time the search felt different. It was no longer about confirming dates or boundaries, it was about finding absence. They began with land acquisition records, tracing ownership of the wetlands before the park's establishment. The documents showed a familiar pattern: private holdings consolidated through state purchase, followed by federal designation. There were references to drainage efforts, failed agricultural use, and eventual abandonment. Nothing unusual. No mention of disposal sites, storage facilities, or waste management operations. Next came infrastructure maps. Blueprints from various decades revealed service roads, canals, pump stations, and temporary structures built and dismantled as land management philosophies evolved. The ranger compared these maps with his memory of the terrain. Some features aligned, others had vanished entirely. Yet none corresponded to the precise location or scale of the lockers. They moved on to environmental impact assessments, particularly those conducted during the park's early years. These reports cataloged contamination risks, previous land use concerns, and mitigation strategies. The language was thorough, often excessively so, but again, there was nothing that matched what had been found in the swamp. No flagged anomalies, no unresolved hazards. What became increasingly apparent was not what the archives contained, but what they did not. There were gaps in certain periods, especially the years preceding the park's establishment. Some documents referenced earlier studies without including them. Others mentioned prior conditions vaguely, as if the authors themselves had incomplete information. It was not proof of wrongdoing, but it suggested discontinuity, a break in record-keeping that could conceal as much as it revealed. The ranger felt a familiar frustration. He had encountered this before in other contexts, the way official histories smoothed over complexities to present a cleaner story. The park, like many protected lands, had been framed as a restoration project, a return to nature. That narrative left little room for acknowledging inconvenient remnants of human activity that did not fit neatly into preservation goals. As the hours passed, the search expanded beyond the park's own records. State environmental agencies were contacted, their databases queried for any permits or violations linked to the area. The responses were slow, fragmented, and largely unhelpful. Jurisdictional changes over the decades had scattered responsibility across multiple offices, some of which no longer existed in their original form. By late afternoon, the administrative mood had shifted. What began as cautious curiosity edged toward concern. The absence of documentation made it increasingly difficult to explain the lockers as benign. Without records, liability questions emerged. Environmental risk assessments would be required. Law enforcement would need to be notified, if only as a precaution. The ranger returned to the archives one last time that day, alone now, reviewing a set of microfilmed county planning documents from the mid-20th century. These were not park records, but municipal files transferred during a reorganization years earlier. He scrolled through zoning changes, infrastructure proposals, and budget summaries, most of them mundane. Then he noticed a reference that stopped him. It was brief and easy to overlook, a single line in a larger report discussing the closure of a regional educational facility. The document did not name the institution directly, referring to it only by function and location. There was mention of decommissioning procedures and disposal costs associated with equipment and materials. The specifics were absent, deferred to another report that was not included. The ranger noted the reference carefully, marking it for follow-up. It was not enough to establish a connection, but it introduced a possibility. Educational facilities often used lockers, large quantities of them, and closures, especially abrupt ones, generated logistical challenges that were not always handled transparently. The following morning, specialists arrived at the park. Environmental consultants, law enforcement representatives, and a hazardous materials assessment team convened to review the situation. The ranger accompanied them to the site, retracing his route through the restricted wetlands. The swamp greeted the group with the same indifferent calm, its surface reflecting the sky, concealing its depths. The consultants examined the lockers with practiced detachment, noting corrosion patterns and possible leakage points. The law enforcement officers focused on the chains and locks, photographing them, discussing methods of securing and transporting such a structure. No one speculated aloud about the contents. It was too early, and the implications too serious. The ranger stood slightly apart, observing. He watched how each professional interpreted the same object through a different lens. To the consultants, it was a contamination risk. To law enforcement, a potential crime scene. To him, it was something else entirely, a fragment of history that had surfaced without context demanding to be understood. As preparations began for a controlled extraction, the ranger felt a growing sense of inevitability. The lockers would be opened. Whatever lay inside would be cataloged, analyzed, and reported. The park's tranquil image would fracture, replaced by questions that could not be easily answered. The archives had failed to provide clarity. Instead, they had confirmed something more unsettling. The lockers did not belong to the park's documented past. They existed outside its official memory, placed there before preservation, before oversight, before accountability. They were not an oversight in record-keeping, they were an erasure. As the team finalized plans to bring the structure out of the swamp, the ranger looked once more at the sealed doors. The metal bore the marks of time, but the intent behind its placement remained intact. Whoever had put the lockers there had counted on silence, on water and mud to do what paperwork could not. They had trusted that no one would think to look. That trust, he realized, had been misplaced. The decision to remove the lockers from the swamp was made with a caution that bordered on reverence. What had begun as an irregularity had hardened into a certainty that whatever lay sealed behind the corroded metal did not belong to the land, and had never been meant to be found again. Plans were drawn carefully, measured against environmental protocols and legal obligations, weighed for risk and consequence. The ranger watched this process unfold with a patience shaped by years of waiting on weather, on seasons, on the slow compliance of terrain. Still, there was an urgency beneath the restraint, a shared understanding among those involved that the longer the lockers remained submerged, the greater the danger they posed. On the morning of the extraction, the swamp looked deceptively calm. A thin veil of mist clung to the water, softening the outlines of trees and disguising the machinery that had been maneuvered into position along the restricted access route. A temporary road of reinforced mats had been laid to support the weight of the crane and support vehicles. The ground, saturated and unstable, resisted every attempt to impose order upon it, but the preparation had been thorough. There would be no rushing this process. The ranger arrived early, standing at the edge of the operation as the crews made final adjustments. He had walked this stretch of wetlands countless times, but seeing it transformed into a site of extraction altered his perception of it. The familiar sounds of birds and insects were now punctuated by the low mechanical hum of engines and the occasional metallic clang as equipment was tested. The swamp, indifferent as ever, absorbed these intrusions without protest. When the crane's cable was finally lowered into the water, the depth of the concealment became evident. Divers had worked the previous day to secure the harness around the lockers, their reports describing resistance not just from weight, but from the suction of mud that had claimed the metal over decades. The lockers had not merely been placed there. They had been surrendered to the swamp, allowed to settle and be claimed as part of its hidden strata. The lift began slowly. The crane strained, its cable tightening as the machinery applied steady force. For a long moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the surface of the water trembled, ripples spreading outward in concentric circles. Mud churned, releasing bubbles that carried the sharp, unmistakable odor of decay. The ranger felt it catch in the back of his throat, a reminder that what lay beneath was no longer inert. Gradually, the lockers began to rise. The first visible sections broke the surface reluctantly, metal emerging coated in black silt that slid away in thick sheets. Water poured from seams and vents, cascading back into the swamp as if the structure itself were bleeding the land that had held it. The chains binding the lockers clinked softly against one another, a sound that seemed impossibly delicate given their mass. As more of the structure emerged, the scale of it became undeniable. What had appeared as a partial row was now revealed as a continuous wall of lockers, far longer than initially estimated. The crane adjusted its angle, compensating for the uneven distribution of weight as the submerged end resisted release. The tension in the cable was visible, a taut line connecting past and present. When the last section finally broke free, there was a collective stillness. The lockers hung suspended above the water, dripping and glistening in the pale light. Dark fluid seeped from vents and corroded seams, staining the ground where it fell. Environmental officers moved quickly to contain the runoff, deploying absorbent barriers and monitoring equipment. The smell intensified, sharp and chemical, cutting through the damp air. The structure was lowered onto a prepared platform, its full length now visible. The ranger walked its perimeter slowly, noting details that had been impossible to see before. Faded paint, once institutional green, flaked away to reveal bare metal beneath. Numbers and letters, once crisp, now ghosted the surfaces, barely legible but persistent. These lockers had belonged somewhere. They had been part of an ordered environment, cataloged and assigned. The decision to open one was not taken lightly. Protective gear was distributed, protocols reviewed. There was discussion of whether to transport the structure intact to a controlled facility, but concerns about leakage and stability argued against further movement. If there was a breach, it needed to happen here, where containment measures were already in place. The ranger stood with the others as the chosen locker was identified. It was one near the center of the row, its lock heavily corroded but still firmly in place. A deputy approached with bolt cutters, testing the metal experimentally before committing. The first attempt barely nicked the rusted shackle. The second produced a sharp crack as the weakened metal finally gave way. The sound echoed strangely across the swamp, louder than it should have been, as if the land itself registered the violation. The lock fell to the ground, landing with a dull thud. For a moment, no one moved. The locker door, warped by time and pressure, resisted when the deputy pulled on it. Then, with a groan that seemed almost organic, the metal began to open. The ranger was close enough to see inside as the gap widened. At first, his mind struggled to categorize what his eyes registered. The interior was packed, not with debris or tools, but with containers stacked meticulously from floor to ceiling. Glass reflected the light in dull, uneven glints. Liquid sloshed faintly as the door moved, the motion setting off a subtle, collective shift within. The smell hit next. It was unmistakable and overwhelming, a chemical sharpness that cut through every other sensation. Several people stepped back instinctively, hands rising to masks that suddenly felt inadequate. The ranger felt his stomach tighten, his breath shallow despite himself. As the door opened fully, the contents resolved into clarity. Glass jars of varying sizes filled the locker, each sealed and labeled, though most labels had long since faded. The liquid inside was cloudy, preserving shapes that should never have been confined to such spaces. Human anatomical specimens were arranged with a precision that suggested routine, not haste. Limbs, organs, fragments of bodies reduced to study materials. And then there were the smaller forms. Late-term fetuses suspended in their glass prisons, their presence undeniable and devastating. The ranger felt a wave of vertigo, the ground seeming to tilt beneath his feet. This was no longer an abstract violation or an environmental hazard. It was a record of lives reduced to objects, catalogued and then discarded. The deputy stepped back sharply, his reaction mirrored by others. The professionals who had maintained composure through the extraction now struggled to mask their shock. Cameras were raised, documentation began automatically, but the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. The site was no longer just a recovery operation, it was a crime scene. The ranger found himself unable to look away, not out of morbid fascination, but because turning away felt like another form of abandonment. These remains had been sealed away deliberately, hidden from scrutiny, denied acknowledgement. To look now was to bear witness, to accept the burden of knowing. Orders were given quietly but firmly. The area was secured. Additional containment measures were deployed. Communications were made to federal authorities, the implications too serious to remain within local jurisdiction. The remaining lockers would not be opened until specialized teams arrived, but the truth had already escaped confinement. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the mist, the swamp took on an unsettling clarity. The lockers sat exposed, their secret breached, their presence undeniable. The ranger stood at the edge of the platform, feeling the weight of the moment settle into him. The park he had believed he understood had revealed a layer of itself that could never be unseen. What had been buried here was not simply waste. It was evidence of systematic decisions, of lives treated as expendable, of a past that had relied on silence and obscurity to absolve itself. The breach of that single locker had fractured more than metal. It had broken open a history that would demand reckoning. As federal agents began to arrive and the operation shifted into a new phase, the ranger knew that the lift had been only the beginning. The first breach had answered one question while raising countless others. And now that the lockers had been brought into the light, there would be no returning them to the dark. The hours following the first breach unfolded with a strange combination of urgency and restraint. Nothing moved quickly, yet everything felt accelerated by the gravity of what had been revealed. The locker door remained open, its contents exposed to daylight for the first time since they had been sealed away. Specialists in protective gear worked methodically, documenting every angle, every label fragment, every variation in glass thickness and seal integrity. The ranger stayed close, not because he was required to, but because leaving felt like surrendering responsibility at the very moment it had become most tangible. As containment tents were erected and portable lighting positioned, the interior of the locker was examined in greater detail. What had initially registered as overwhelming horror began to resolve into patterns. The jars were not placed randomly. They were arranged by size and type, the smaller vessels positioned toward the top, the heavier ones braced below. Each shelf bore the marks of long-term storage, faint outlines where glass had rested unmoving for decades. This was not a hurried disposal. It was a transfer, executed with care, as if the integrity of the contents mattered even as their existence was being erased. The ranger watched as one jar was carefully removed and held up to the light. The glass was thick, industrial, designed for laboratory use rather than display. The liquid inside had clouded over time, but the shape it preserved was unmistakable. Labels clung stubbornly to the surface, their ink faded but not entirely lost. Inventory numbers, dates, abbreviated notations hinted at classification systems no longer in use. They spoke of procedures and protocols, of a place where such specimens were routine. As the examination continued, it became clear that the locker contained a mixture of materials. Alongside the jars were sealed metal containers and plastic-wrapped bundles, their contents less immediately visible but no less disturbing. When one such bundle was unwrapped under controlled conditions, it revealed personal effects preserved by accident rather than intention. A folded piece of paper disintegrated at the edges when touched, but enough remained to show handwritten lines, uneven and youthful. A photograph, its image nearly washed away, suggested a group of adolescents standing in front of a brick building, their expressions indistinct but their posture unmistakably formal. The ranger felt a tightening in his chest as the implications settled. These were not anonymous specimens sourced from distant institutions. The presence of personal items, however degraded, anchored the contents to individual lives. Somewhere, at some point, these people had existed beyond the confines of glass and labels. They had names, histories, relationships that had been severed and then deliberately forgotten. Additional lockers were not opened immediately, but preliminary scans using non-invasive equipment confirmed that the contents were consistent across the structure. Each unit appeared to house similar collections, varying in volume and composition, but adhering to the same organizational logic. The scale of the discovery expanded with every confirmation. What had seemed horrific as an isolated locker now threatened to become overwhelming as a system. Federal agents arrived as the day progressed, their presence formalizing what everyone already understood. This was no longer a matter of environmental contamination alone. The involvement of human remains, particularly those preserved under conditions suggesting institutional control, elevated the case beyond local authority. Jurisdiction shifted quietly but decisively. The ranger was interviewed briefly, his account recorded and cross-referenced with earlier reports. He spoke carefully, describing what he had seen without embellishment, resisting the urge to interpret. Yet, even in his restraint, the weight of the truth pressed through. He emphasized the arrangement, the care taken in storage, the deliberate chaining and concealment. These details mattered. They pointed toward intent. As the investigation progressed, specialists began compiling an inventory of the visible contents, working from the breached locker outward. Each jar was photographed, assigned a temporary identifier, and logged. The process was slow, painstaking, and emotionally taxing. Even those accustomed to forensic work showed signs of strain. There was something uniquely unsettling about remains that had been preserved not as evidence of a crime, but as remnants of sanctioned activity. The ranger found himself reflecting on the language used around him. Terms like specimens, materials, and contents circulated easily, necessary for professional detachment but insufficient to capture what lay before them. He understood the need for such language, yet he could not fully adopt it. To him, the objects in the locker resisted abstraction. They asserted their humanity through sheer persistence. As night approached, temporary security lighting cast stark shadows across the site. The swamp, once dim and concealing, now appeared exposed and brittle under artificial illumination. Insects gathered around the lights, their movement frenetic against the stillness of the lockers. The juxtaposition felt symbolic. Life drawn inexorably toward a place defined by its denial. The ranger remained on site longer than required, assisting where he could, observing where he could not. He noticed how often people paused when handling the smaller jars, how their movements slowed, their hands steadied with conscious effort. No one spoke openly about it, but the presence of fetal remains had shifted the emotional center of the operation. These were not distant historical artifacts. They challenged assumptions about consent, purpose, and the boundaries of ethical practice. Late into the night, preliminary findings were shared among the investigative team. The labels, though degraded, suggested a time frame consistent with the mid-20th century. The style of notation, the materials used, and the preservation methods aligned with academic medical practices of that era. This reinforced the emerging hypothesis that the lockers originated from a defunct educational or research institution. The ranger recalled the archival reference he had uncovered, the vague mention of disposal costs associated with a closed educational facility. At the time, it had been an intriguing but inconclusive detail. Now it felt like a thread begging to be followed. The idea that an institution might have chosen concealment over proper disposition no longer seemed far-fetched. It seemed disturbingly efficient. As the site was secured for the night, the ranger took one last walk along the length of the lockers. He counted them again, this time with a clearer understanding of what each represented. Dozens of metal doors, each concealing a chapter of a story that had been deliberately fragmented and submerged. The swamp had done what it was asked to do, absorbing the weight and the secrecy, holding everything in suspension. He stopped near the breached locker, looking once more at the exposed interior. The jars reflected his image faintly, distorting it through layers of glass and liquid. For a moment, he felt as if he were looking into a mirror that showed not his face, but his responsibility. The park had been entrusted to him and others like him to protect and preserve. Yet, protection, he now understood, could not be limited to landscapes and wildlife. It extended to truths that had been buried beneath them. When he finally left the site, escorted back through the darkened wetlands, the ranger carried with him a profound sense of obligation. The contents of the lockers could no longer be treated as refuse or relics. They demanded recognition, investigation, and, ultimately, dignity. What should never have been buried had been brought into the light, and with that exposure came a reckoning that could not be avoided. The breach had opened more than metal doors. It had opened a passage into a past structured by authority and silence, a past that now pressed insistently against the present. And, as the investigation moved forward, the ranger knew that the hardest truths were still waiting, sealed not in glass, but in the systems that had allowed such a burial to occur at all. The investigation moved forward with a momentum that felt both relentless and restrained, as though the truth itself were advancing carefully, aware of the damage it could cause if released too quickly. What had been recovered from the swamp could no longer be viewed in isolation. The contents of the lockers demanded context, a point of origin, a chain of decisions that explained how such materials came to be preserved, cataloged, and ultimately abandoned beneath layers of water and mud. Federal investigators began reconstructing the past not through memory, which had failed, but through fragments. The ranger watched as the process unfolded, aware that history was being assembled in reverse, starting with what had been hidden and working backward toward the moment it was first set in motion. The jars, the labels, the notation styles all pointed toward a specific era, one in which institutional authority operated with minimal oversight and ethical boundaries were often defined by convenience rather than accountability. Records from regional medical schools and affiliated institutions were requested, many of them stored in off-site facilities or archived in formats no longer in common use. What emerged slowly was the outline of a school that no longer existed, an institution that had once stood less than 20 miles from the park's current boundaries. Officially, it had been described as a combined educational and corrective facility, a place designed to provide instruction and rehabilitation to troubled youth. Its name appeared briefly in mid-century directories, then vanished entirely after its closure in the early 1970s. The ranger learned that the school had operated under a dual mandate. On paper, it was an academic institution offering vocational training and remedial education. In practice, it functioned as an intake center for adolescents deemed undesirable or unmanageable by other systems. Many of the students had been transferred there through court orders, social services placements, or parental consent obtained under pressure. Demographically, the population was heavily skewed toward marginalized communities, a detail that appeared nowhere in the official mission statements but became undeniable when enrollment records were cross-referenced with census data. Medical oversight had been framed as a benefit. Students received regular examinations, psychological evaluations, and ongoing monitoring. These services were cited in funding requests as evidence of progressive care. Yet, the documentation recovered by investigators told a different story. The medical records found within the lockers matched ledger entries from the school's infirmary, records that had been thought destroyed. They detailed procedures that went far beyond standard care, experiments conducted under the guise of observation, data collected without meaningful consent. The ranger felt a tightening in his chest as the scope of it became clear. The school had existed in a time when regulatory frameworks were weak and ethical review boards either non-existent or easily circumvented. Research ambitions often outpaced moral considerations, especially when the subjects were those society had already sidelined. The students had been seen not as individuals but as resources, their bodies and development treated as variables in long-term studies. When the school was eventually shut down, the official reason cited was restructuring and budgetary constraints. There had been no public scandal, no trial, no reckoning. Staff were reassigned or retired. Buildings were sold or demolished. The institution dissolved quietly, leaving behind little more than a footnote in municipal records. What remained was the problem of what to do with the materials it had accumulated. Proper disposal of biological specimens required incineration or burial under strict regulations, processes that were expensive and subject to oversight. Investigators uncovered correspondence suggesting that administrators sought alternatives, framing the issue as a logistical challenge rather than an ethical one. A private disposal contractor was eventually engaged, tasked with clearing out equipment and materials quickly and discreetly. It was here that the trail converged unmistakably with the swamp. Invoices recovered from county archives referenced transportation costs to an unspecified remote site. No coordinates were listed, no permits attached. The language was vague, deliberately so. The ranger recognized the pattern. Ambiguity was not accidental, it was protection. The choice of the wetlands had been calculated. At the time, the area was not a protected park, but a neglected stretch of land considered unusable for development. Seasonal flooding made access difficult, and its ecological complexity discouraged scrutiny. Dumping the lockers there ensured that they would sink, settle, and be forgotten. Water would obscure them. Time would erase the rest. The ranger imagined the process as it must have unfolded decades earlier. Trucks arriving under cover of routine operations. The lockers still sealed, loaded, and transported as units. The chains tightened not out of necessity, but out of finality. Once submerged, there would be no reason to return. As investigators pieced together this sequence, the emotional tone of the case shifted. What had initially been framed as improper disposal hardened into something more damning. The concealment was not incidental. It was intentional, motivated by the desire to avoid cost, exposure, and accountability. The decision to drown the evidence reflected a belief that the people represented within the lockers did not warrant remembrance. The ranger struggled with that realization more than he expected. He had spent his career protecting land from exploitation, from careless use and deliberate harm. Yet this history revealed a different kind of violence, one that did not scar the landscape visibly, but left a residue no less destructive. The swamp had been turned into an accomplice, a silent partner in erasure. As the findings were prepared for public release, discussions arose about how much detail to disclose. There were concerns about liability, institutional reputation, and potential legal consequences. Some argued for restraint, for focusing on environmental remediation rather than historical accountability. Others pushed back, insisting that the full truth must be acknowledged. The ranger found himself firmly aligned with the latter. He had seen firsthand what silence allowed. The park's tranquility had been built, in part, on ignorance. To restore trust, that ignorance had to be dismantled. Late one evening, after another long day of briefings and document reviews, the ranger returned alone to the edge of the swamp. The extraction site was quiet now, secured and guarded, the lockers removed for further examination. The water had begun to reclaim the disturbed ground, smoothing over the scars left by machinery. It was as if the land were eager to resume its role as concealment. Standing there, the ranger reflected on how easily the past could be buried, not just physically, but socially. Institutions closed, records were lost, narratives shifted. Without deliberate effort, injustice dissolved into obscurity. But the swamp had not forgotten. It had held on to the truth, however reluctantly, until circumstances forced it upward. Flooding, erosion, chance, all had played their part. Yet it was human curiosity and responsibility that ultimately brought the history back into the open. The ranger understood now that the lockers were not merely containers. They were symbols of a system that had chosen expedience over humanity. A system that had assumed time and water would absolve it. That assumption had failed. As the investigation moved toward its next phase, focusing on consequences rather than origins, the ranger felt the weight of continuity. The past was no longer distant. It had intruded into the present, demanding response. And as the truth spread beyond the boundaries of the park, it would reshape not only public understanding, but the very meaning of preservation. The history that had been drowned was surfacing at last, and with it came an obligation that could no longer be deferred. The revelation did not remain contained within the boundaries of the park for long. News moved outward with a force that mirrored the floodwaters which had first exposed the lockers, seeping into every channel available, carrying the fragments of the truth far beyond the wetlands. What had begun as an internal investigation now unfolded in public view, and with that exposure came consequences that no containment protocol could fully control. The park was partially closed within days. Official notices cited environmental concerns and ongoing remediation. language chosen carefully to balance transparency with caution. Barricades appeared along trails that had once been open, and maps were revised to redirect visitors away from affected zones. Rangers, who were accustomed to guiding families and answering questions about wildlife, now found themselves managing confusion and unease. Visitors asked why their favorite paths were inaccessible, why the atmosphere felt tense, why the park seemed different. Answers were offered, measured, and factual, but the underlying truth could not be fully disguised. Environmental teams began the slow work of assessing contamination. Water samples were taken from multiple depths and locations, soil cores extracted and analyzed for chemical residue. The swamp, long considered resilient and self-correcting, was revealed to have absorbed more than organic decay. Traces of preservative compounds lingered in sediment layers, their concentrations highest near the site where the lockers had rested for decades. The ranger watched as data points accumulated, forming a picture of prolonged exposure that had gone unnoticed because no one had known to look. Remediation plans were drafted with the understanding that complete erasure was impossible. The swamp could be treated, filtered, monitored, but its history could not be undone. Some damage would remain, not necessarily visible, but present nonetheless. The ranger felt a familiar frustration at this reality. Preservation, he knew, was always a negotiation with loss. The difference now was that the loss carried a moral dimension as well as an ecological one. As environmental work progressed, another effort unfolded in parallel, quieter but no less significant. Investigators began cross-referencing the recovered materials with missing persons records, school enrollment lists, and fragmented medical archives. Names surfaced slowly, often tentatively, as partial matches and circumstantial connections. For each potential identification, there was a family somewhere who had lived with unanswered questions for decades. The ranger was not directly involved in this process, yet he felt its weight keenly. He had spent years learning how landscapes remembered, how water and soil preserved traces of the past. Now he was witnessing how people carried memory in different ways, through absence, through unresolved grief, through stories passed down without confirmation. The lockers had not only contained physical remains, they had sealed away closure. When the first families were contacted, the impact rippled outward. Some reacted with disbelief, others with a sorrow so deep it seemed to consume language itself. For a few, the news offered a grim relief, an end to uncertainty even as it introduced new pain. The ranger followed these developments from a distance, reading summaries, listening to briefings. Each update reinforced his understanding that the consequences of the discovery extended far beyond the park's borders. Public response intensified as details emerged. Media coverage oscillated between outrage and solemn reflection. The park, once celebrated as a refuge, became a focal point for discussions about historical injustice, institutional neglect, and the ethics of preservation. Commentators debated responsibility, asking how such a history could remain hidden for so long, how many similar sites might exist elsewhere, concealed beneath narratives of progress and restoration. Within the park administration, tensions surfaced. Some officials worried about reputational damage, about funding, about the long-term implications of being associated with such a discovery. Others argued that the park's role as a steward of land now included stewardship of truth. The ranger aligned himself quietly with the latter view. He had never believed that preservation was about aesthetics alone. It was about integrity. Meetings stretched late into the evenings as policies were reconsidered. Training programs were revised to include historical context alongside environmental education. Restricted zones were reevaluated, not just for safety, but for what they might conceal. The ranger noticed a subtle shift in how his colleagues spoke about the land. There was more humility now, an acknowledgement that not everything beneath their care was benign. The park's closure affected the surrounding community in tangible ways. Local businesses that relied on tourism felt the strain immediately. Some residents expressed anger, blaming the investigation for economic disruption. Others expressed gratitude that the truth had finally surfaced, even at a cost. Community forums grew crowded, voices overlapping as people grappled with how to reconcile pride in the park with the knowledge of what it had concealed. The ranger attended several of these gatherings, not as an official spokesperson, but as a listener. He heard stories from longtime residents who remembered rumors about the old school, whispers that had circulated briefly before fading away. He heard from people who had fished the swamp for years, unaware of what lay beneath the water. Their reactions ranged from shock to guilt, emotions tangled with a sense of shared betrayal. Through it all, the ranger felt an internal conflict sharpen. He was proud of his role in uncovering the truth, yet he was acutely aware of the pain it had unleashed. He questioned himself in quiet moments, wondering whether ignorance, however unjust, might have spared some suffering. Each time, he returned to the same conclusion. Silence had not protected anyone. It had only delayed accountability. As weeks passed, the park began to reopen in stages. Clean zones were declared safe, trails restored with new signage that acknowledged the investigation without sensationalizing it. The swamp itself remained restricted, its future uncertain. It was no longer just a natural feature. It had become a site of memory, a place where history and ecology intersected uncomfortably. The ranger resumed his patrols, though they felt altered now. Each step carried a heightened awareness, not just of environmental impact, but of human presence, past and present. He found himself pausing more often, considering what lay beneath familiar ground, what stories remained untold simply because no one had thought to ask. The consequences of the discovery were not confined to policy changes or public discourse. They reshaped the ranger's understanding of his own role. He was no longer just a guardian of land. He was a witness to its past and an advocate for its truth. That responsibility weighed heavily, but it also clarified his purpose. As the investigation moved toward its final phase, focused on restitution and remembrance, the ranger sensed that the most important work was still ahead. Cleaning the swamp and reopening the park addressed immediate concerns, but they did not resolve the deeper question of how to honor what had been lost. The park had been changed irrevocably, not because its landscape was scarred, but because its story had expanded. It could no longer be presented as a simple sanctuary. It was now a place where beauty and harm coexisted, where preservation required honesty as much as protection. And within that complexity, the ranger continued his work, aware that the land he walked carried not only water and roots and wildlife, but the echoes of lives that had once been reduced to silence. By the time the final phase of the investigation began, the park no longer felt like the same place the ranger had once known. The changes were subtle in appearance but profound in meaning. Trails reopened, signage was replaced, and visitors gradually returned. Yet the land carried itself differently now, as if the truth that had surfaced had altered its posture. The swamp, once dismissed as an inaccessible margin of wilderness, had become a focal point of memory, its quiet no longer neutral. The decision regarding the remains was reached after long deliberation. Federal authorities, medical ethicists, representatives of affected families, and local officials weighed options that none of them had ever expected to confront. The conclusion, when it came, was unanimous in principle, if not in emotion. What had been preserved without consent and discarded without dignity would be returned as much as possible to a state of respect. The specimens were no longer evidence alone. They were human remains, and they would be treated as such. The ranger was present when the final transport left the secured facility. He watched as containers were loaded carefully, each labeled not with inventory numbers, but with identifiers meant to restore individuality. The process was quiet, deliberate, stripped of spectacle. There were no cameras allowed, no statements made. It was not an event meant for public consumption. It was an act of restitution. In the weeks that followed, families were given the option to receive remains when identification was possible. For some, there was closure in that finality. For others, the uncertainty persisted, records too incomplete to establish definitive connections. In those cases, the decision was made to inter the remains collectively, acknowledging both the shared injustice and the individuality that had been denied. The burial took place on a rise of land near the edge of the park, chosen not for its prominence, but for its quiet permanence. The site overlooked water, not the swamp itself, but a stretch of river that moved steadily, carrying reflections of sky and trees alike. The ranger stood among a small gathering of officials, family members, and community representatives. There were no speeches, no formal rituals imposed beyond what families chose to observe privately. The earth received what had been withheld from it for too long. In the days after, the site was marked with a modest memorial. It bore no grand inscriptions, no declarations meant to satisfy history books. Instead, it listed dates, a brief acknowledgement of lives lost, and a simple statement affirming remembrance. The ranger appreciated the restraint. Memory, he had learned, did not require embellishment to endure. As the park administration finalized plans to reopen all remaining areas, discussions turned toward how the site of discovery itself should be treated. Some argued for permanent closure, suggesting that continued access risked disrespect. Others believed that concealment, even now, would echo the original act of erasure. The compromise reflected a new philosophy. The swamp would remain largely inaccessible, protected both for ecological reasons and out of reverence, but its story would be acknowledged openly in educational materials and guided programs. The ranger was tasked with helping to develop those materials. He approached the responsibility with care, insisting that the narrative remain grounded in fact rather than sensationalism. The park's story, he believed, should not be reduced to its darkest chapter, but neither should that chapter be softened. Visitors would learn that preservation included confronting uncomfortable histories, that nature and humanity were entwined in ways that could not be separated neatly. Returning to his patrols, the ranger felt the rhythm of his work settle into something steadier. The intensity of the investigation had faded, replaced by a quieter vigilance. Yet he remained aware that his relationship with the land had changed irrevocably. Every step through the wetlands now carried an added dimension, a recognition that the ground beneath him held layers of meaning beyond soil and water. One afternoon, months after the lockers had been removed, he found himself walking the perimeter of the former extraction site. Vegetation had begun to reclaim the disturbed earth. New growth pushed through where machinery had scarred the surface. The swamp, resilient as ever, was healing in its own way. Yet the ranger knew that healing did not mean forgetting. He paused at the water's edge, listening to the familiar sounds that had once defined the place for him. Birds called, insects moved through the reeds, and the water reflected the sky with deceptive calm. It would be easy, he thought, to believe that nothing extraordinary had ever happened here. That was the danger. The land remembered, even when people chose not to. It held on to what it was given, preserving it until conditions changed and the truth could no longer be contained. The ranger understood now that his role extended beyond enforcement and maintenance. He was a caretaker of memory as much as territory. As he turned back toward the path, the ranger felt neither pride nor sorrow, but a steady resolve. The park would continue to welcome visitors, to offer beauty and refuge. But beneath that surface would remain an honest acknowledgement of its past, a recognition that preservation without truth was incomplete. The lockers were gone. The remains had been laid to rest. The investigation had reached its conclusion. Yet the story did not end there. It lived on in the land, in the memorial, in the changed understanding of those who worked within the park's boundaries. And as the ranger resumed his quiet patrol, he carried with him the knowledge that some places do not simply exist. They remember. If this story made you stop and think, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel to see what other truths history tried to hide, and watch the next videos to uncover stories that were never meant to be found. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, because some stories only matter if they're remembered.